Hello, I'm the 10-minute English teacher. Let's get you exam ready. Today we're thinking about an Inspector Calls by JB Priestley, and I'm going to be providing you with key moments, quotes and analysis for the character Sheila. Before we move on, don't forget to like and subscribe. We've got guides for all the characters and the acts of the play on the channel. Okay, a summary for Sheila. So in front of you now are the key moments. I'm going to take it that you're familiar with the play. If you're not, there are plenty of tutorials on the channel to help you be familiar with the play. These are key moments involving Sheila. I'll walk you through them now. So we've got our first impressions of Sheila. At the beginning of the play, she is one of the Burling family. They're rather pleased with themselves, it says in the stage notes, and she's quite an infantile character, quite two-dimensional. She calls her mum Mummy, and is getting married to someone called Gerald Croft, who's the son of a wealthy business owner. And she's likely to enjoy a life similar to her mother's, who is a very cold and miserable woman. And Mrs. Burling says to Sheila, men with important work sometimes have to spend nearly all their time on their business. So we understand that when she does get married to this person, Gerald Croft, she's probably going to end up living a life very similar to her mother's. The inspector speaks to Mr. Burling about his involvement with the girl's death. He's rather indignant and doesn't see how he's responsible or can be held responsible. Sheila's response is very different. She's had the girl sacked from a place called Millwoods because the girl smiled while Sheila was in a fit of temper, and her response to this is very different. So she's somebody who starts to reflect on what she's been involved in very early on in the play. She says, if I could help her now, I would, which is very different to the way that her father responds. But she does also feel sorry for herself and says, I feel I can never go there again. So there's a little bit of self-pity from Sheila at the same time. The inspector then wants to speak to Gerald, her fiancé, and he wants to try and hide the truth from the inspector, whereas Sheila is a lot more keen for him to tell the truth. And she says to him, why, you fool, he knows. And it's interesting that when they speak, the inspector and Gerald, she's starting to see the world through a different pair of eyes, and she's less metaphorically blind at that point, and says, you were the wonderful fairy prince. You must have adored it in regards to his relationship with Eva Smith, but also perhaps she was her fairy prince, and she started to see things in a different way. After she's found out that her fiancé Gerald has had a relationship with Daisy Renton, she's called herself at that point, she then gives the ring back to him, although she does say that she respects him more than she's ever done before at that point. The inspector then speaks to Mrs. Burling, who has refused to give the girl money when she came to her charity committee asking for help. And Mrs. Burling says that a public example should be made of the father who has got this girl pregnant. And Sheila, who is a step ahead of the family, says, now, mother, don't you see? And the idea of being blind to the truth is explored there when Sheila challenges her mother. The inspector then leaves, and there's a clear divide between the younger characters and the older characters at that point. And Sheila quite interestingly says, I'm going anyhow, as if she's going to leave the family or go at least leave the Burling household. So there's a clear division between the younger characters and the older ones. Mr. and Mrs. Burling think they're the victim of a hoax, and Sheila and Eric, her brother, are quite clearly reflective at that point and realise that they've had a part in this girl's downfall. Interestingly, Sheila then gives her parents a way out of taking responsibility for what they've done by questioning the identity of the inspector. And at the very end of the play, when the characters have started to think about whether or not they have been hoaxed, Mr. Burling suggests that Sheila takes the ring back from Gerald, and she says, it's too soon, I must think. So she hasn't actually said no, it's just too soon. So we could also argue that maybe Sheila, whilst she has been the reflective character and she's challenged her parents, she could easily end up falling back into the life and future that we were expecting her to be in at the beginning of the play. And that takes us to quotes to know. Okay, so at the beginning of the play, Mrs. Burling says men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time on their business. So Sheila's going to end up living a life very similar to her mother's. You be careful or I'll start weeping, is what she says to Gerald when some jokes are made. But it shows that she's quite a fickle, juvenile, two-dimensional character at the beginning of the play. She also calls her mother, Mrs. Burling, Mummy. Interestingly, after the inspector calls, she calls her parents mother and father to show that there's a bit of change in her. She's grown up a bit after that point. Those girls aren't cheap labour, they're people, is what she says to her father, Mr. Burling. So she's got a little bit more empathy and a little more understanding of the situation, the working classes, compared to her father. "Why, you fool, he knows," she says to Gerald at the end of Act 1 when he wants to hide the truth from the inspector. "If I could help her now, I would," is what she says after she realises that she's played a part in the downfall of the girl. But she also says, "I feel I can never go there again." So there is a little bit of her feeling sorry for herself, a little bit of self-pity, and not really putting the impact she's had right at the forefront. "You were the wonderful fairy prince. You must have adored it," is what she says to Gerald when she finds out that he took the girl as his mistress. And also that phrase fairy prince has got all sorts of allusions to fantasy. Maybe her life and her future with Gerald was just simply fantasy and fairy tale to her. "I respect you rather more than I've ever done before," is what she says to Gerald. She's actually seeing Gerald as a different person and respects him. And "impertinent is such a silly word," is what she says to Mrs. Burling, her mother, when she challenges the inspector. Manners is a motif in the play, and when Mrs. Burling says that the inspector is impertinent, it causes Sheila to laugh, and she says impertinent is such a silly word. She also says, "Now, mother, don't you see?" And that theme of blindness, or the motif of blindness, you could argue, is something that crops up there. She challenges her mother to try and put the pieces together when we and she can realise that it's Eric who is the father of the girl's baby. She says, "I'm going anyhow." We've got quite a bit of respect for Sheila at that point because she wants to leave the Burling house and possibly leave the family, although she doesn't actually leave. She stays put right until the end of the play when the phone rings. And she says, "It's too soon now, I must think," to Gerald. So she doesn't say no to taking back the wedding ring and that engagement. So those are the quotes there with some of the key words taken away. What you could do now is pause here and then see how many of those you can complete yourself. And if you can't, you can go back and hear them read to you one more time. And that takes us to analysis. So we can see Sheila as a symbolic character. She's a symbol for upper middle class young women, and Priestley uses Sheila to explore and critique their social role. So she's seen as a child by her parents. They call her the child, and Eric is a boy. And they're the property of their parents until they provide her as a wife to Gerald, at which point she'll be viewed as an adult and then his property instead of Mr. Burling's. Her role as Gerald's wife will mirror the role Mrs. Burling plays to Mr. Burling, which doesn't seem to fulfil her. Sheila must accept her role and depend on Gerald, or she'll lose her place in the upper middle classes, which is perhaps why she doesn't leave at the end of the play after promising to. She's been conditioned to long for a fairy prince to benefit her parents, and her life is a bland fantasy. We can also, however, see Sheila as a dynamic character, one who changes. Static characters don't, and Sheila does to some respect. Sheila and her brother Eric change, accepting responsibility for their actions. And Sheila goes from being a metaphorically blind and two-dimensional character to being a dynamic character with insight that her parents don't have. But there is an alternative interpretation that you could provide for Sheila. You can also argue that she doesn't completely change, and that Priestley might have wanted the audience to then want to seek change for themselves in society instead of expecting the Sheilas of the world to change for them. She feels self-pity that she can't go back to Millward's. She says she will leave and doesn't. She's the one who questions the inspector's identity when he leaves, and she doesn't say she won't take Gerald's ring back, just that it's too soon. Okay, if you want to take it further, this is what you can do. Mute the video and watch it again. And can you talk your way through the moments in time with the yellow marker? If you get stuck, you can unmute to hear the explanation of those key moments. And also, you could go back and can you explain the significance of each key quotation instead of me doing that for you in time with them changing. Okay, check out the other videos on my channel. I'll continue to add content. Feel free to ask for something you'd like to see me cover in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share, and keep revising.